Hello, everyone. Welcome to In Conversation With. This is a podcast we've had going on for about half a year now at ASBMB, and this was the brainchild of the Education and Professional Development Committee. In this podcast, we interview professionals who hold advanced degrees in life sciences about their careers and career journeys. My name is Chandrima, and I'm a postdoc at the University of California, Berkeley. I'm also a member of the ASBMB EPD committee. We've already recorded and released several episodes that are available on the ASBMB website that you could download or listen. So far, we've invited guests from different career paths for our interviews, but in this episode, we decided to switch things up a little bit, and I'm going to interview my co-host, Dr. Chris Heinen, who's the professor of medicine at the University of Connecticut School of Medicine and the director of postdoctoral affairs at UConn Health. Chris is an internationally recognized cancer researcher whose work spans molecular genetics, cancer biology, and stem cell research. Over the past 2 years, he's not only built a thriving research program, but also played a key role in shaping the academic careers of countless graduate students and postdocs. So today, we're going to get some insider information about Chris's own journey into academia, the realities of today's faculty job market, and advice for early career researchers preparing for their next big step. So, Chris, could you start us off about telling us a little bit about your career trajectory? When did you decide you wanted to be a professor, and how did you enter into this field of DNA repair?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Chandrima. So let me switch over here to the guest chair for this. So this is great. When did I decide that I wanted to be professor? Probably when I got the job offer to be a faculty member is when I ultimately decided. It wasn't necessarily something that I had my heart set on from a very early age. I think, like probably many trainees, I was just going through the steps that you go through and kind of think about your career and worry about your career, but not really sure how it's going to play out. I didn't walk into grad school knowing that, all right, I want to be a faculty member. That's what I want to do. I imagine, like many, certainly back in my day, I didn't even know what it meant when I stepped foot into grad school, what it really meant to be a research faculty. So it's sort of something that developed over time. I would say, I went on to do a postdoc after graduation, in part, quite frankly, from inertia, because that is the next step that you take, right? And certainly back when I was a student many years ago, when we didn't really talk about other career options nearly as much as we do today, that was sort of the next step. And so I took that next step. But I will say, even during my postdoc years, I sort of explored around different possibilities. I thought about different career avenues. I volunteered in the Science Museum in Philadelphia. I even actually at one point applied for a job as an editor at Nature Genetics and then decided not to take it. Um, and at some point, getting later on in my postdoc, I didn't really fully plan on applying for faculty positions. I didn't start this like large wave of applications. It was really word of mouth that a colleague had told me about a position where I actually am here today at UConn Health, where they were looking for someone that did the molecular biology of colon cancer, which is what my expertise was, what was my training was on. And so I applied for that job and got that job. So it wasn't, once I applied for that job, I then sent out some other applications as well. But it wasn't like this was like one of 50 things that I started applying for because I was on this track of faculty. So it wasn't this straight line by any means. And so yeah, there wasn't this there really wasn't this aha moment. I was sort of uncertain all the way through up until, opportunity knocked.
That's such an incredible story. And I love listening to how you describe that it's not a linear path because in my postdoc right now, talking to people I know and just people who want to get into the academic job market, there's this idea that a very specific type of person that's done everything right all through grad school and their postdoc gets to become a professor. So it's
Yeah.
really great to hear that like that isn't necessarily true. But
I
kind of
didn't do
looking
everything right.
So what did you do, right? Looking back, like what were the pivotal moments that like ultimately drove you here and that set you up for success in a professor role?
Yeah. Well, I think for starters, I trained with really smart people. That's not always in your control, but as much as it can be in your control, make it be. I had a great graduate mentor who taught me an awful lot. Um, and then I had a postdoc mentor who was just a really smart scientist, really had great ideas. I learned an awful lot scientifically from him. And it put me in position to be competitive, right? I mean, I think it's what I tell people that are interviewing here all the time. Grad school, there are lots of good places you can go to grad school. You really just want to learn science and learn how to do this well. For a postdoc, postdoc reputation starts to matter a little bit more, right? And you need to um, it helps to work for someone that has a network that is going to help you. In this case, it turned out the person that recommended me for the job I have wasn't my postdoc mentor, but nonetheless, people knew my postdoc mentor, they knew his work, and so that certainly helped. And then the other thing, quite practically, is it put me in the position to publish and to publish, strong papers, and that's important. There's sort of no getting around that. Any of us that are in this going to grad school and doing postdocs, we need to publish, regardless of whether we want to be a faculty member or not. That is our proof that we've done well at the job that we're at the time. But if you want to be a faculty member, of course, it really matters. If you want to go become a research faculty, it really matters. And you don't necessarily need a science or a nature paper. I didn't have a science or a nature paper, but you do want some strong publications that are fairly high profile.
Yeah, that's always true. Like this is, I guess, our currency as scientists, our papers. Like this
Right.
is how we show productivity.
Yeah.
I want to dig a little bit deeper about the networking aspect that you mentioned.
Yep.
Uh, in addition to like learning about jobs and openings in other universities, for a faculty career, you often need other people who are not your direct advisor to support your application in some way to write you letters. How would grad students and postdocs go about cultivating such a network?
Sure. Well, so for starters, if you've gone to grad school and then you've done a postdoc, you got two right there,
Mm-hmm.
right? And hopefully they're people that have at least a mutual respect, if not necessarily a strong relationship. Um, I think those are going to be the two most important recommendations usually anyway, because those are the people that know you best, know your training and your sort of work habits best. And so those are the people that the review committee, the hiring committee, is going to really be reading closely. But beyond that, how do you accumulate a broader network? Well, there's lots of different ways. An obvious way that happens is through scientific collaboration. So if you're a postdoc, your PI might be collaborating with somebody, and that becomes part of your project. So you are, an extent, collaborating as well, of course, and you may get to know the people at the other lab or the other sites or the other PIs, for example. Um, and you'll have lab meetings. You'll obviously, you may publish together, and they'll come to respect you as well, and your work as well. So that's one really strong way. And then the other thing is just in your own local network, right? And as a grad student, that's a little easier to do because obviously, you get to know the other professors through classes. You usually have your thesis committee. You get to know other faculty. But when you're a postdoc, it's a little bit trickier because that stuff is not often automatically built into the program. And so
Mm-hmm.
as a postdoc, you need to sort of make a little extra effort. And that can be done in a couple of different ways. One is you can just say, listen, I would like some outside mentors besides my PI, and I'm going to go seek out people that might be able to provide me that mentorship, depending on whatever the topic might be. And so through word of mouth or just through the reputation, otherwise, I'm going to identify those people. And then, of course, locally, you might also have scientific collaborations, and you'll get to know faculty that way. But the one sort of trap I see many postdocs fall into is that it's very different than grad school. You don't have this built-in community necessarily as a postdoc, except for your lab. And it's very easy to fall into that trap and then sort of separate yourself away from the rest of the university you're at. And I think that's a big mistake. It is a mistake. And so I really always strongly encourage postdocs to get involved. Get involved, whether that's your postdoc association or just whatever events are going on your campus. Meet other faculty, because it can only help you. It can only help you to expand that network locally. Um, and then we were talking about finding a job, but thinking beyond that, the postdocs that you're working with now, and maybe even the grad students that you're working with now, many of those may become future faculty members and part of a community that you'll be working in down the road. And so to have developed those relationships with them back in your training days will continue to pay dividends for you professionally, because now they're going to be out there, right? And if they're in related fields, they might even be reviewers and things like that, right? And so to have those relationships already developed, can only help. So there's so many reasons as a postdoc to get yourself out there at your local institution and do more than just hide up in the lab every day.
Yeah, that's super important. It's like in every field, your network is basically what's going to carry you forward.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
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 So I want to like come to the faculty job search a little bit. You've
Sure.
obviously searched on multiple faculty search committees. And from that perspective, what are some things hiring committees really look for in strong candidates? Or like what are some green flags when you see a candidate and you're like, this is the person?
Yeah, well, so some of the things that I mentioned earlier, right? One is obviously we're gonna go right to your CV, almost even before, at least for me, before I look at even anything else, because I want to see if, I want to get a quick sense of whether or not you truly are competitive. And the CVs, the CV, and by CV, of course, I mean, your publications. It's not just that there is sort of like some entry ticket. You have to have good publications, but those publications are meaningful. I mean, when you publish something, um, it indicates that you can take something from the beginning to the very, very end, and that's important. Those of you that have published, and I joke about this with my students, but once you've done all the research and all the work in the lab, that's like the halfway point, right? Getting the actual
Oh, yeah.
publication there's still a long ways to go, right? In terms of the writing and the rewriting, getting it through the reviewers and everything that comes with it. And that's what you're going to be hired to do, right? And so those publications are an indication that you, not just that, you have good ideas and you can do good lab work, but that you can see this all the way through to the very end. And so there's just no getting around that. You have to have published. Um, and so then we get into sort of the quality of the work, and there's just no denying it. We're human beings, and so the lab that you come from is going to matter. It doesn't necessarily mean, you didn't work for a Nobel laureate. It doesn't mean you're never going to get a job, but there's just that's just the way we are as human beings, right? If you're working for a lab that has published a lot of good work and has developed a reputation, those are obviously going to be points in your favor. That being said, that's not a guarantee. And I've seen this with faculty too, where they come from a big famous lab and then they get someplace on their own and they can't quite recreate what they were able to do in a big lab when they had like two techs working for them and more money than they knew what to do with, right? That's not how you will be when you start off as an independent faculty member. And we can get more into that in a minute.
Oh, yeah.
So that's not a guarantee, but there's no question that it helps. Um, but it also is not the only way to do it. I mean, if you don't come from a big, super famous lab, you're not necessarily locked out. It just makes it a little easier. Um, but then obviously we're going to go to the science. So you're going to write a research statement, and that research statement gives us a sense, obviously, what you're going to be working on when you're here, but it also gives us a good flavor of your ability to communicate and kind of what your first grant is going to look like. Because, for us as faculty, as research faculty, we're talking, those of us that are predominantly researchers, um, that's what we do. We have to get grants to be successful, right? So that's kind of what as a search committee, that's sort of what we're trying to predict, which is really, really hard. But trying to
Mm-hmm.
predict, is this person going to be successful at getting grants? That's kind of what we're evaluating. And so
Mm-hmm.
your past publication record is a part of that. But then your research statement is important because it gives us a sense of your ideas, your plans, your kind of specific plans of what you're going to be trying to work on first, and then whether you can communicate that, right, in writing. And so all that is important.
Right. Yeah, so in certain job types, you're told again and again to tailor your application, tailor your application to the specific role that you're applying to with the specific company, etc. In the
Mhm.
academic job market, it's a little bit different because you're putting forward your research idea and
Yeah.
like you mentioned, what your first grant is going to look like. But is there some amount of tailoring you still need to do for specific schools, and like what's that going to look like?
Well, I only think about that a little. I mean, the reality is it's hard to fake that because your research is what it is, your expertise is what it is. Um, you the thing about writing a grant, and so therefore demonstrating that you will be able to write a grant during the job search, it has to be a combination of I've got a good idea for an important problem, and I'm the person who can do it, right? Or my lab is the ones that can do it, right? And so you can't fake that. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? You can't
Right,
tweak that all that much, right? So
right.
you can't write to a particular job search or job ad that doesn't speak to who you are and what your interests are and what you're good at, right? It would
Hmm.
just be hard to fake. And you would be setting yourself, even if you could somehow fake the search committee, eventually you'd run into a wall when you go to
Hmm.
apply for grants there. So you can't tailor it a whole heck of a lot. That being said, what you what you tailor perhaps is where you apply, right? So what are the job ads that I'm responding to? What are the programs that I'm responding to? Do I feel like I could be a fit? What I do well is a fit. And so, for example, in my story is a perfect example of that. Was I the best, professor candidate available the year that I was out there on the field? No, probably not. But I was good enough, and what I did was exactly what they were looking for, right?
Hmm.
And
Right.
that was a matter of fit. And so sometimes you get lucky and you find places that are looking for maybe not your exact specific area, but just your general field, right? For me, it was sort of they were looking for colon cancer molecular biologists. That's kind of what I
Right.
was, right? And so in some ways you can sort of tailor it in terms of where you apply, right? Um, but not all job ads are like that. Some job ads are a little bit broader than that. And so you apply, and in some ways that question of tailoring is almost taken out of your hands. Like they kind
Right.
of know what they're looking for. They
Hmm.
have even if they don't say it in the job ad, sometimes they have a sense of kind of what they want in terms of an area of expertise. And so
Hmm.
that, so you can apply, but the decision of whether you go further is a little bit out of your hands. So I don't, yeah, like I said, I don't really know how much tailoring you can do
Right.
just because you're putting your best foot forward, and your best foot is what it is.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about the fit aspect of it. We did talk about how the department's looking for something. If you happen to be that fit, then you're lucky and you get the job. But looking at it from the candidate's point of view, what are some questions they should ask to ensure that they are, or like the department's a good fit for them?
Yeah, yeah. Well, okay, so it when you come in, depending on where you're applying to, um, there's one scenario where you're joining sort of a team that's in place. There are other researchers that maybe don't do exactly what you do, but they're trying to build up a program, right? And that's one aspect. Then there's other aspects, maybe at places that aren't quite so big, where they want to expand into an area, and you kind of fit that, right? And so you sort of need to evaluate, what the nature of the job is, where you're going, and then decide whether, whether or not you're comfortable with that reality. Are you happy being, I'm a DNA repair person, so am I happy being one of 10 DNA repair people? I just happen to be in my particular specialty.
Mm-hmm.
Or that's not the case where I'm at now. Am I okay being one of the few DNA repair people because they wanted to start growing this colon cancer domain, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's one thing you want to figure out for yourself is, what scenario are you comfortable with? And are you okay with that, finding out what that is by the people that you meet when you go through that job search process? Because you will get contacted if you pass sort of the first screen, and then they may do a virtual interview. Nowadays, people will often do a virtual sort of first pass interview,
Mm-hmm.
and you'll get brought to campus, right?
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully you'll meet with, if the search committee is smart, they'll have you meet with the relevant people that you might be working with when you arrive. And so, hopefully you'll get the opportunity to meet people and envision whether I can work with them scientifically and that our interest areas mesh in a way. And then also, obviously, the best that you can in one visit, will I work with them interpersonally? Do I like the way it is? And let's not sell that short. I think the environment is really super important because you're going to be there for, you know, hopefully a few years, if not 21 years like me, right? And so, do you get a sense of how that place is? Are people collegial with one another? Do they collaborate? Is it very competitive and cutthroat? Do I feel like there's support that's available both from the leadership of the university, but also just sort of the support that's offered in terms of administrative support? And those are some of the things that you can find out by asking the faculty that you're interviewing with, right? Their
Mm-hmm.
experiences. Um, what kind of lab do I want to run? Do I want to run a lab with graduate students? Well, what is the graduate program like there, right? So those kinds of aspects in terms of what you envision that you want your lab to look like and you want your career to look like. And then again, not to diminish this at all, but do you want to live in this place where this university
Right.
is, right? I mean, you know, we can't always be, beggars can't be choosers when it comes to this job market, but at the same time, right? You have to be real. You may end up being there for quite a while. Are you and if applicable, your family going to be happy there?
Right. Yeah, that is a important consideration, even if not like the top consideration when
Yeah,
looking for a job.
yeah.
Um, we talked a little bit about the virtual interview and the on-site visit but maybe for like the younger students who are listening to us, could you just outline what the different interview processes are typically in a faculty interview?
Yeah, yeah. So obviously the first pass is going to be your CV and maybe a letter, uh,
Mm-hmm.
depending on where you go. But that's usually the first pass, and then they'll write you back and they'll say, okay, send us a longer research statement, which is usually a few pages, maybe a statement about teaching, um, and then so it depends. But like I said, here what we've been doing lately is we've been sort of doing a screen where we narrow down to, like, let's say several finalists, and
Mm-hmm.
we might do a Zoom type of interview like this. And it's really we have a pretty good feeling about them on paper already. I guess we want to make sure that they can talk the talk and that there are no surprises. So that
Mm-hmm.
first interview is really more about, are there any surprises that, now that we see them in real life, that
Mm-hmm.
we're going to find out either about their personality or whether or not, what's on the paper really reflects them. Because, sometimes you worry about that, right? Is that what's on paper, not a product necessarily of them, the individual? And so you can get a sense of that by just basically that first interview. And that first interview is really, at least from my experience, it's not it's not too terribly rigorous. You're not going to give like a full-blown job talk. You might give an abbreviated version. They might sort of ask you to summarize kind of what you're working on, and so you might give a very abbreviated version of your research, and you might get a few follow-up questions about the science and just to kind of get a sense. And they might have they might give you an opportunity to ask them a couple of questions. So it's always a good idea to have some questions of your own prepared,
Right.
to make it clear that you're really thinking about this and what it might mean. But assuming that that you're that really is your work on the page, and you know what you're talking about, and you can defend that pretty well, and you know that you're a reasonable person, you know, you'll probably get invited to come on campus. And so that, you know, places will do either one or two in-person visits. And so the first in-person visit is you'll often now sit down one-on-one with the job search members, the committee members rather. It's a chance to dig a little deeper, and then also for you to dig deeper into them and the institution, right? So that's when you really start getting into your questions with them, the resources they have, the core facilities, the things that, you know, would be important for you. Um, you may meet some of the leadership on that first visit. Sometimes that happens on the second visit. Sometimes that happens on the first visit. You know, sometimes the department chair isn't on the search committee, and so you might meet the department chair
Okay.
at that meeting for the first time. But the idea is that you'll probably meet several faculty members, including the search committee, and just a few more that are in that department that might be looking to hire you. And then you're going to give a talk. I mean, that almost always happens. And that talk is sort of like, this is my polished sort of 50-minute slides. You know, this is my research story.
Mm-hmm.
What we do, and I imagine most places do, is you'll also give a second talk, sometimes on that visit, sometimes on the follow-up visit, that is sort of, we call it the chalk talk. And the chalk
Right.
talk now is no slides. Literally, you're getting up on the board. We don't use chalk anymore, but you use the whiteboard. And and now we're like, okay, I kind of told you about what I've done. The chalk talk is what I'm going to do now if you hire me, right? So
Got
it
it.
builds off of what you've done. There's a natural extension. Those two
Mhm.
talks are going to overlap. But now we're going to really get into, okay, if I was going to sit down today and write my first R01, this is what it would look like. And that's really what that chalk talk is. And that's important because
Mhm.
they want to see that you have ideas, that you've thought it through, that you kind of are beginning to develop the strategies for grant writing, um, and that you can, you know, communicate a plan to them. And then from that, you know, you will get a sense and they will get a sense of whether or not, you know, I can execute this plan at this institution, right? So those are the most important things. And then if that all goes well, you may get invited back for a second visit. Often places will do a second visit. And and at that point, you don't necessarily have the job yet, but you are, they're probably down to a couple finalists if you're coming back for a second visit. You might be the finalist if you come back for a second visit, but most likely, you know, if you're not the finalist, you're one of two or three. And now it's really, okay, you impressed us already, right? On
Mhm.
that first visit. You know, you still have to obviously behave on your second visit, but
Right.
but
Mhm.
now we're really like, okay, let's get into the details of, is this going to work? Could this work here, right? So you might meet the dean, you might meet some of the important sort of leadership people. You will meet people now that you've really requested to meet, for
Mhm.
example, because you really now, like, I'm really in decision mode thinking, is this going to work for me? And so
Right.
there may be people you want to meet that you didn't get to meet before, and you'll let them know. You might start getting into conversations about what you need for your lab at this
Mhm.
point. So at some point, they sort
Right.
of ask for that shopping list, right? Of
Mm.
what do you need? What type of equipment do you need? What kind of resources do you need? Some of that may start to play out on the second visit. You know,
Mhm.
we're going to show you, for example, this particular instrument that we already have. Will this suit your needs, right?
Mhm.
You may see lab space at that point. And in fact, I would say if you haven't seen labs, you should ask to see labs at some point. And preferably the lab space that they're planning for this position. They should
Mhm.
have an idea at that point what that lab
Right.
space is going to look like. Sometimes they don't. But at least you can get an idea of approximately what it will look like, right? Because that is kind of important to know. Are they going to stick me in a nice facility, or am I going to go off in some corner in the old part of the building that's 50 years old, right? Because that's all they got for me. So anyway, so that's another thing that on that second visit, you make sure that you see the labs, and hopefully the lab that they're thinking of you going into. So
Got it.
that's kind of the process. I think that covers most of it. And then at some point, either on the first or second visit, probably the first visit, you'll meet some of the trainees. That's usually a very normal
Mhm.
thing to do. You might have lunch, for example. I'm sure
Yep.
you've
Yeah.
done that as a postdoc, right?
Gone on those. Yeah. They're super fun.
Yeah, exactly. And those are important too, because what happens is that once you leave, of course, everyone talks about you behind your back, right? So
Right.
everyone's going to be asked for their feedback on you. So in much the same way that, I was joking about being on your best behavior, but obviously, your rapport with the students is not going to be the most important thing, but it will be part of the evaluation. The students will be asked for their feedback as well.
Yep. Yep. We get sent a Google form every time we go for lunch with our fellow
Right, right. So
credit.
you've been on that end of it. Exactly.
Yeah. No, this was great. Thank you so much for going over them. That's like raised so many questions and we can hit them off one by one. So we mentioned the job talk and the chalk talk.
Yeah.
What for you separates like a good job talk from a truly memorable one?
Well, so I mean, the reality is that by the time you get to that point, most of the people that we see that we've brought in to interview are, they're serious people. They're serious candidates now, right?
Mhm.
And they've had decent training or really good training, and they're good scientists. They wouldn't have made it to that point if there wasn't a lot of evidence that they, had their act together. So most of the job talks we see are pretty good. Um, I mean, to be honest with you, the more memorable ones are the ones that are like kind of surprisingly not so good. Um, but I
So we don't
think,
want to be memorable.
yeah, right. Um, I think there's a couple of things. One is it still comes back to your story, right?
Hmm.
Do you have a compelling story? There's just no substitute for that. Is my research, relevant, important, and can I deliver it as a compelling story? And I think that's something that's undervalued sometimes. Um, is that even though this is science and it's supposed to be hard and facts and everything else, is that we're still storytellers at the end of
Hmm.
the day. That's how we communicate with one another. That's how we influence people so that we get grants and papers and jobs. Is our ability to convey what we're doing as a story. So the best talks general, and you guys know this from just going off to see research talks. The best talks are compelling stories. You get hooked by the story, right? Same is true for a job talk, right? So a compelling story is going to attract your attention. The second thing is again, like we were talking about earlier, you can't fake it, right? So you do have to come across as the expert. And so if you're struggling because people are asking you questions and you can't answer any of them, or at least many questions we ask in science are not right wrong questions, but have you thought about this, or can you convey thoughts about the types of things that you're being asked that make it clear that yeah, I'm there's always more we can learn even in our own fields, but I'm at a point now where I'm establishing myself as a world expert in this area, and that's conveyed in the way that I can talk about my field and give you interesting thoughts about some of the questions that you're raising, right? So those are all important. And then, as I mentioned earlier, that chalk talk is, does it look like I have interesting ideas and I'm starting to organize them in a way that makes for a fundable grant?
Hmm.
And that's a little bit difficult because especially when you're starting out and you don't really exactly know. You can get certainly some feedback from people. So obviously you're going to practice these things like crazy. Hopefully you
Hmm.
have a supportive PI at your postdoc lab that will work with you on this. Not everyone feels comfortable with that. Um, and so you might want to find others that you can talk with and go through things with, but hopefully that is your PI. That always makes it easiest. So that you can kind of practice these things and get some feedback. You're going to write, even if you don't have to submit it for the job search, it's always a good idea to write a specific Ames page for what that first R1 might be. I mean, it can
Hmm.
change, obviously, once you're actually in the job, but that gives you something that you can work off of for this whole process. And so that's something I would recommend doing. And that's something that obviously you can have others read to kind of see if that's in good shape. But I think those are the most important things. And then of course, like I said before, it's not number one on the list, but people are going to hire somebody that they want to work with for the next
Right.
number of years. And so the more you can come across as, you know, personable, um, and dynamic without sort of going overboard, right? And being sort of
Right.
silly, right? You want to be professional. So there's this sort of sweet spot where, you want to be personable and friendly, but sometimes I see trainees that go a little overboard and they're just kind of goofy, right? And I don't even know, they may not even realize they're doing it, but you
Right.
want to find that sweet spot where I'm personable, I'm someone you can relate to, but I also I'm a serious person, right? And
Right.
that comes across.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks for outlining that. Another thing we mentioned was to, look at the lab space and look at the core facilities. And this kind of brings me to my next question about negotiation. Like, what are
Mhm.
things, once you're offered the job, that you can ask to negotiate? And like, what are things you can maybe
Yeah.
push back on a little bit? What are things like, you shouldn't toe the line too much? Yeah. Can you just
Yeah.
elaborate on that a
So
little
for
bit?
anyone listening to this, this is one of those questions. All these things we're talking about today, you know, ask others these questions and get multiple pieces of advice on this. I'm not a good negotiator. So I'll just put that out there as a caveat to anything I say. Um, that being said, um, if we're hiring you, we're going, whether you're a master negotiator or not, we're going to be putting a significant financial investment in you.
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore, we really, really want you to be successful, right? We don't want you to fail. And so that means that, we want to make sure you have what you need to be successful, right? Different places have different amounts of money, and so not everyone can give you everything that your heart desires. But, if you need a particular microscope or particular piece of equipment to do the work you plan to do to be able to write grants, if we can't give it to you, then that's not about playing hardball negotiation. That's just I can't be successful there, right? So that's sort of, for me, that's sort of the first layer of negotiation, and the most important is, there are just certain things I absolutely have to be successful. And if you can't do it, then I think we're done here. Not because I'm playing hardball, but because that's just the reality. I can't be successful. I'm not gonna be able to go forward without it. So I think that's the first and most important level of negotiation or discussion. But then beyond that, then you start getting into how much startup money do I have to open up my lab, and that's something where it's, listen, it's a lot different than when I started, so I don't even have a frame of reference anymore. But
Mm-hmm.
can talk to you can talk to people in your own place sort of about, new faculty that you may know at your current institution. If you have a good relationship with the chair of the department, or obviously your own PI, these are all people that you can talk to get a ballpark figure. But what you'll do is, like I said earlier, you'll make that shopping list kind of
Mm-hmm.
things a new lab needs to start
Mm-hmm.
out, and right off the bat, you'll get a sense of how much money I want, and then it's okay, how much extra money can I have to hire personnel to get started, right? I'd really like to have a little bit of money to hire a technician or a graduate student to kind of get off the ground, because I'm not going to have a grant when I walk in the door. Um,
Mm-hmm.
One important question you need to find out is, how much of your own salary are you expected to cover? And
Got
that's
it.
both true in perpetuity for my career there, but then also in year one. Like, am I going to get 100% salary coverage, and for how long? Because that will also dictate how much startup you need. Because if they're like, oh, we give you 80% of your salary, but you got to pay the rest out of your startup or
Mm-hmm.
grants or whatever,
Right.
obviously that's going to impact how much money you need to ask for as well. But I think those are the most important things that you need to consider for negotiation. I mean, like any negotiation, if this is the only job offer you have,
Mm-hmm.
then you're going to be a little bit careful about pushing for too much. If you've got a couple places, you've got a little bit of leverage. But I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I don't know. For me personally, I don't feel like that's the game we're playing here. We're not trying
Mm-hmm.
to win the negotiation, right? We're just trying to be successful, and they want you to be successful. So,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I think that's the most important thing.
Mm-hmm. Are there anything outside of like startup funds and lab related funds that you could potentially negotiate? Because I know outside of things that are required to make your research successful, a lot of people are able to negotiate, say, spousal hires or like other personal things like that. Like, are there a few other things you could talk to the
Yeah.
department about?
Well, so right. So I don't know whether that's a negotiation or not, but yeah, but the sort of famous professional two body problem, right? If you
Uh-huh.
got a spouse that's going to come with you, what are they going to do? I mean, universities are on one hand, they're used to this. They're aware of this problem. They've worked with this problem before. On the other hand, they, can't solve it all the time. When they
Right.
can, they do what they can to help. If your spouse is in a completely different area that has nothing to do with academia, they're going to be limited to what they can do other than trying to find leads, right? And
Mm-hmm.
guide you in the right direction for any job search. Sometimes if you have a situation where you're both academics, sometimes they have a little more control to be able to sort of help you line up a second position. And we've certainly seen that happen. We have a number of husband-wife teams here, for example, where they came in together, and maybe the one of the pair was the primary target, but
Mm-hmm.
a job was offered to the spouse as well, right? So that absolutely happens at academic institutions. And so you're right, that can be part of the discussion. But I mean, I guess I would almost argue that's not so much you playing hardball. That's more like this is something I need for me to be able to
Right.
come to. My spouse has got to have a job. They have their
Mm-hmm.
own careers, right? So help. Let's solve this, right? Because I want to come there. So
Right.
that's sort of the way to approach that. I mean, in terms of other things, I'm sure there are things that I'm not thinking of right now off the
Mm-hmm.
top of my head, but obviously equipment is one, lab space could certainly be
Mm-hmm.
one, startup funds could be one. Um, you probably don't necessarily have to negotiate. Well, okay, let me take that back. It depends what kind of institution you're going to. If you're going to a medical school like mine that's predominantly research,
Right.
I'm not really negotiating protected time
Mm-hmm.
because when I walked in the door, I think I was like 95% research. That was their expectation of me, right?
Mm-hmm.
My effort has changed over the years. But for some institutions, like let's say you're going to go to an R1 undergraduate campus where you
Mm-hmm.
want to do research and they're expecting you to do a lot of research, but there it is an undergraduate campus, and so there is teaching that goes on.
Mm-hmm.
You might have to have conversations about, okay, I don't want to have a heavy teaching load in my first couple of years to see if I can get some R1s off the ground and sort of earn all my research time. So those kinds of things can probably be negotiated depending on the institution that you're going to.
Got
But at
it.
a place like mine,
Mm.
that's not really necessary.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It totally depends on the type of institution.
Yeah.
Um, Another question I had was, what do you think starting out, early career researchers underestimate about life as a faculty member at a medical or health sciences institution or at a university? But I'm specifically asking you medical or
Yeah,
health sciences
yeah.
institution.
I think the biggest thing is we have no idea what we have no idea about, right? Like so it's just that classical trope, but it's true
Right.
that there's so much that is involved in starting up a lab and running a lab that was not part of training. And even if you try to be observant and watch what your PI is going through,
Mm-hmm.
you don't always see it all, appreciate it all, or know it all. And so there's just a lot that this job is we go from being a scientist and whether that's a dry lab scientist or a bench scientist that's doing that's doing this hardcore science every day and thinking about science all the time to in a sense running a small business. That's
Mm-hmm.
really what this job is. And I joke, not even a joke, that my biggest strength is not my science. I think my biggest strength is sort of my organizational skills and my communication skills. And those are almost more important than my brilliant ideas in many ways. And because that's sort of what is involved. And so I think that's one thing is just like it just constantly getting hit with realizing, oh man, there's so much more to this job than and maybe you know it, but until you actually experience it, you don't really
Right.
know it, right? The other thing I'll say is that it's I liken that first year to running in quicksand in that you come in and you're like, I know I went to work today, but man, I don't think I got a darn thing done. And it feels like that for at least a year. And of course, it's not true. Things are happening, but you just, you're so used to, again, only having to worry about the lab work that, over a year, you can see like all this experiments getting done. And when you're starting out, you're just like, oh man, I just blew this whole day trying to track down the facilities people to install a plug in my lab so I can plug in the new instrument that came in, right? And like there's all these things and I don't I can't even think of examples. There's so many of them that it's just like I just feel like I'm not getting anything done. Now, when you stop and you really look back honestly, you've come an awful long way, but it will feel in the moment like you're stuck. And there's just sort of no getting around that. You just have to go through it.
Hmm, fair. Was the like what kept you going during this time?
Well, I mean, it's, as human beings, we get together, we often focus on our problems, but the reality is it's still a pretty great job. I mean, we get to come to work every day and and learn, right? And research things that are interesting to us and learn new things and have, a fair amount of freedom in doing that. And so at the end of the day, all of the stuff that you hear your faculty members complaining about, and there's plenty to complain about, uh, they're complaining about it because they don't want to leave it. It's still a pretty great gig, right? I mean, we get to play on what we want to play with every day and really interesting, fascinating things, right? And that's hard to top. And you're surrounded by people that are really smart and the vast majority of people are really friendly and they're just good people that have the similar sort of altruistic goals that you have. And so and then the other piece of it is for you probably need to enjoy being involved in training, whether that's teaching in a classroom or just teaching in the laboratory. So for me, it's one of the things I love about this job is I get to mold young minds, right? And so, but in all seriousness, it's not about that. It's more about just this sense of joy I get from watching, you guys essentially make those big steps in your development and in your training, right? It's really cool to see that all the time. And so I think all these things outweigh all the things that we whine and moan about, which is probably what you guys only hear us doing. But it's because there are all these great things that we don't usually talk about out loud that are there that keep us wanting to do with it.
Yeah, that's fair. It's like if you look at it, it's a pretty great job. And even an early career professor, I heard someone say that people are always complaining about, you have to get tenure in 5 years, but like for the 5 years, your job's basically guaranteed. And that's a kind of job security you don't get in any other industry.
Right.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that's right. No, you're right. I
Mhm.
mean, there is anxieties. We have a lot of uncertainty, certainly around grant funding and things like that. But you're right. There's a long glide path out if things aren't going well, longer at least. No
Mhm.
one's going to turn around and fire me tomorrow, right?
Right.
I mean, obviously, I still get my own job anxieties like anybody else when grants end and things like that. Um, but I mean, we're a little bit spoiled because it's a little bit softer than out
Mhm.
there in the real world.
I'm gonna like switch gears a little bit and talk more about
Right.
like your leadership roles in,
Yeah,
you've held many leadership roles in grad programs, postdoctoral affairs. You work
yeah.
at the EPD committee at ASBMB. What drives you to like work on these committees and like what does that responsibility kind of look like?
Yeah, so I think these are things where we talked before about starting out and the things you need to do starting out. And at some point, you will get involved. I mean, being part of being a faculty member means being part of the university community, right? And there are other things that have to happen in this community, teaching certainly, but also different administrative jobs, different committees, um, ultimately maybe different leadership positions. And some of those things are seen as a bit of a burden, quite frankly. And initially, you want to be careful about not taking on too many of those things. Hopefully, you've got a chair that's kind of looking out for you and protecting you from that.
Mm-hmm.
You want to do some of those types of administrative roles because you're going to need it for your tenure, and you just want to get involved. I think how heavy you go in that direction, whether it be administration, whether it be teaching, it sort of depends on, to some extent, on you, um, and whether or not that you find that rewarding at all. And so for me, I think my decision to get a little bit more involved in leadership and my role, so you mentioned it, but I'm the director of postdoctoral affairs here. I play a major role in developing the curricula for our graduate program and in sort of running some of the courses for our graduate program. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I also am the chair of a committee here that's more of a research committee, but it's a faculty committee that kind of helps the institution figure out how to spend their money in terms of research dollars. And so these are all things that I sort of evolved into over the years. I didn't jump right into these right away. Um, but so I think it came from you kind of, in the same way you work your way up the ladder in terms of research positions, you'll work the way up your ladder in terms of these types of admin positions. So you may start out as a committee member, and then you might move into a chair position, and then from that you might move into a higher type of administrative position. Um, and I think there are certain things I enjoy, and I'm a little weird in that way. Not every faculty member enjoys some of these things. Um, I enjoy uh, working together on teams and solving some of these problems. And so obviously we do that in science a lot, but there are also just sort of immediate on the ground problems of how you run a large organization like a university that is a little bit different in terms of sort of the muscles in your brain that you have to exercise, but it's still sort of rewarding in that you're working with other people to solve a problem, right? That then has a tangible output. And so I think I find that almost like it's a chance to kind of take a break from the other side of it, which is the hardcore science side of it. Um, but it's still kind of related because it feeds back into the science. It's important for the science to be done, and so
Mm-hmm.
it's still part of that same mission. So I think I enjoy that. And then the other role, it comes back to what we talked about earlier, which is I really love working with trainees. That's part of something I didn't know that going into it, but I figured that out fairly quickly. That I love sort of talking to the students in my lab and sort of seeing them grow and develop, and then from that being able to sit on committees with other students and going beyond, and then I ran the graduate program in our area at one point, and that gave me a chance to work with the students in the graduate program beyond just my lab, and so that was rewarding. And then ultimately, the dean asked me about when this position for postdoctoral affairs opened up. The dean had asked me if I would consider it, and I said, yeah, I would like that. So I've been doing this for like 10 years now, and again, it's just enjoyable. You kind of get to have a little bit of an influence that's bigger than just your day-to-day work in the lab, because now you have a chance to sort of uh, work with people across the whole institution, right? And in a slightly different capacity. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it's a different dynamic and a different relationship than you might have as a PI with your immediate trainee, right? So,
Right.
but those are things that you evolve into over time, and because you find it rewarding, right?
Right. Yeah. That makes sense. As director of postdoctoral affairs, and obviously you work with graduate students before, do you have any advice for current postdocs that are preparing for the academic job market now? Because it's like kind of an uncertain market, and like people are a little bit more I don't know,
Yeah.
concerned than usual.
Well, okay, so I mean, listen, it's any crystal ball I might have had was certainly broken in this past year. So I don't quite know where we're going to be 6 months from now, 1 year from now, 10 years from now. It's difficult to say with everything going on. That being said, we've certainly seen hard times before. I have faith that, you know, whatever happens over the course of the next year, a couple of years, that, we'll eventually get back to a place where we're moving forward. I think, an example I give, you guys now are too young for this, but in 2008, this country went through a terrible recession. You guys were probably kids back when that was going on, but it was really bad, and the whole country felt it, and the NIH felt it. So the pay lines were gone. Universities had hiring freezes. It was a scary time. Um, but it didn't last forever. There was a year or 2 years that were really like very dire, but we got through it. The thing is that there's always a bounce back, and so even now, if things are get worse than they are now, um, I suppose the good news is that there's most likely going to be a bounce back. I mean, let's face it, the vast majority of the country, no matter their political party, agrees and supports what we're doing. They think health research and science research in general is important. Maybe some of the politicians that have big mouthpieces right now don't espouse it quite as loudly as they used. This used to not even be an issue. This used to be completely bipartisan. In fact, there was a study I saw the other day that Republicans invested more in science than Democrats, right? Today, you would never imagine that the way the conversation's going. But the point is that science has generally been pretty much nonpartisan. And I think we'll get back to those days because I think most people recognize the value in it. Um, and so I do fully expect there'll be a bounce back from any hard times we go through. And what that means is that they will be, my prediction is it'll be a big bounce back too, because there'll be a lot of senior level faculty that, just stopped doing it during this phase. They decide, okay, it is time for me to retire, which is something that, we need, all right? Some of us old folks need to start thinking about making way. But I think that's going to happen naturally in the next couple of years. And there's also going to just be this pent up demand at the universities. Like if they are going through some hiring freezes right now, or at least slowdowns, the thing is when those start to end, there's like this wave, right? It's like, okay, now we can start hiring again, and everybody will want to hire again. And so there will be this bounce back. So I guess my point is try to, first just keep doing what you're doing in the moment that you're at, right? Keep staying busy, keep doing good work, do all the things you would do normally anyway. Um, but not get too defeated, right? And the reality is that this whole year we really have been panicking a lot about science and where it's all headed. There have been some things that have happened that have clearly been bad, but to date, some of our worst sort of, like I remember back in February, we were all talking these like nightmare scenarios about this is it, we're done, like science is dead in America, right? And it's not dead. And some of our worst fears have not happened yet. Now, I'm not saying we're out of the woods by any means, but don't let your fears run away from you, right? I mean, it may not be quite so drastic.
Awesome. Well, on that hopeful note,
Yes.
uh, the last wrap-up question that I always ask everybody,
Uh,
if you had a way to meet your younger self, perhaps when he was finishing up undergrad or starting out in grad school, what is one thing you'd like to tell him about how his career is going to play out?
yeah, I think what I would say is to not get too caught up in the uncertainty that you're going through right now. Um, you know, I won't have known how it worked out. And looking back, it's easier to look back than it
Mm-hmm.
is to look forward. But the reality is that none of us can look forward. It's all uncertain. And while that can be scary, at the same time, it is the way life is. And so there's no sense in letting that crush you, that uncertainty, that's not knowing if it's going to work out, right? It's going to work out. If you're listening to this podcast, then it probably means you're in school and in this area, and you've got a bright future ahead of you. You may not know what it's going to look like. I don't know what it's going to look like, but it's going to work out. So just sort of go with the uncertainty. It's okay. And don't get too caught up on creating a vision. Like if I were to create the vision of where I am today, man, that would be stressful, right? Because I'm setting up this expectation for success. And the truth is that none of us know what our future success is going to look like, right? We just don't know. And so if you put too many restrictions on that, then you are setting yourself up for stress and for disappointment. But if you kind of go in open, I mean, I'm not saying that you don't plan and you don't prepare and you don't, work hard every day, but at the same time, don't put binders on what success and what fulfillment and what happiness is going to look like for yourself. And then you will get old like me one day and you'll be able to look back and say, hey, you know what? I had no idea it was going to turn out this way, but I'm happy with how it's turned out, right? And that's where, that's where you are right now. That's where the trainees listening to this, you guys are all there right now. So don't put these binders on what is success for yourself.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chris. This was a wonderful interview. I think we covered a lot of ground. This will be super helpful for the trainees listening and who are interested in an academic job.
Yeah. Well, I think it's clear it's a good thing that when I'm asking the questions with you, because I obviously ramble on way too long when I'm answering the questions. So this is probably our longest podcast. So apologize for that. But what I will say, so I'm going to switch back into the host chair here for a second. What I will tell our listeners is that we're actually going to flip this around, and I'm going to get to ask Chandrima questions of her in a future episode. So that will be coming.
Mhm.
But hopefully, we're also going to do a run on some academic positions in the coming months because we haven't really touched on academics that much, and that's obviously still an important area. So we'll be doing some of that, and then we're going to learn a little bit about Chandrima's job and her job search process and everything going on there in a future episode. So stay tuned for that. And lastly, I would say that if you, as always, if you want to continue this conversation, this podcast has a thread going on the ASBMB active site, which is sort of a community message board for people in ASBMB to talk about things. And we monitor that from time to time to see if people have comments or questions, or if there are, for example, jobs that you'd like us to find somebody to interview. Certainly give us any feedback on that active site thread. Thanks, Chandrima. This was fun.
Thank you, Chris.